7:09 on October 22nd. I'd like to open the accessory unit study group meeting. This study committee is a study committee that was formed as a planning board initiative to review the issue of accessory units in the town and discuss a possible bylaw if the need is established. What I'd like to do to start is we went around and did introductions last week. There's a couple of members who couldn't be here last week, so I thought I'd start with some introductions and get to meet you.
Yes, you must be Gary.
Yes.
And Gary, I'm Ginger Winslow. Please don't put the camera on me because I have no lights on Central Street, so I'm not exactly camera ready. For the last 45 minutes I've been walking around in the dark. But it's very nice to be here.
Welcome.
Eileen Richards, also pleased to be here. Sorry I was not in attendance last week.
Glad that you've recovered.
We just go around the room. Mark Cullings, member at large.
Joe Freeman with the Zoning Board of Appeals.
Harry Dorfdick, Chair of the Planning Board.
Dick Cook, member at large.
Marco Board, member at large.
Laura Marwill, member at large.
Tim White here to sit in for Eileen Callahan for Hingham Affordable Housing Trust.
Welcome. I guess we're expecting Peter Bickford to come. So, okay. I think what I'd like to do is, as we start, is perhaps we could just take a look at the minutes which were distributed. This gives you a summary of last week's meeting held on October 16th, which was televised on HCAM. So people in the audience and also at home could tune in and get an update on what we discussed last week.
Gary, can I propose one small edit?
Sure.
On the second page, second paragraph, about halfway down, there's a line that says, Ms. Marwill asked the group if they felt it would be easier to keep the character of the neighborhood. I'd just like to insert the residential character of the neighborhood. So in between the and character, residential.
Okay.
No, I didn't. Gary, are you looking for a motion to?
I'm just looking for a couple of notes that I had. I think it was down on third, let's see, bottom of the first page. There was a discussion on uniformity, and I mentioned that relative to the 1941 provision, and I mentioned that more research needs to be done on this matter. I'd also want to enter into the minutes that Dick Cook mentioned that there also was not case law on the uniformity provision, so I'd like to have the minutes reflect that. See, I had these already. I also, on the top of page 2, the end of the first sentence, the study group then began to discuss unintended consequences and wondered if a proliferation of two-family units or ADUs might change the character of the neighborhood over time. And that we did discuss that. I thought I might suggest that we might say that the committee did make a distinction between an accessory unit and a two-family, and I think the committee, a number of people mentioned a concern about that a proliferation of two-family units would change the residential character of the neighborhood. I think Laura's comment probably reflects that, but I thought we might say something about that too. So I'm thinking maybe we insert in, maybe take, just add a note that a proliferation of two families would change the residential character. And those are all the comments I had. Does anybody have any other comments that you'd like to enter into the minutes?
Would you read that reconstructed?
That sentence, what I was saying, that the study group then began to discuss unintended consequences and wondered if a proliferation of two-family units might change the residential character of the neighborhood over time.
But one of the issues we talked about is whether proliferation of ADUs will change the character of the neighborhood. So it ought to be in there some way.
I'm thinking that
Maybe a different sentence, or?
I think it's a second sentence. What I'm trying to do is make the distinction
Between the two.
An accessory dwelling unit, which I kind of see as a 1.5 family, if that makes sense, as distinguished as as distinguished from a two-family.
Yes.
That's the distinction I'm trying to make, and that's what I heard in terms of the tenor of the discussion last week. So I think I'd like to make that distinction, that we discussed the impact of and how to protect the character of the residential neighbors with an accessory unit in place, and then we also made the distinction that we weren't leaning towards a proliferation of two families, because that definitely would change the character. So maybe that states it a little clearer.
Gary,
Yeah.
I have some concern about referring to one of these units or these properties, if they were to be permitted, as two-family, because one of the issues is whether or not we're going to limit it to a single family with multiple generations.
I agree, Dick. Two-family connotation is rental and non-related, whereas ADU is more totally different connotation. Now, I don't know what the actual definition, but the perception of a two-family is rental out of the two different families.
Gary, are you trying to say that we sort of reached a consensus that two-family was not
Basically.
what we were looking to? That would change the
Basically.
residential character, but we're still discussing ADUs. We're
Yes.
really not discussing two-family.
Maybe we could add that clarification. You're much more articulate in that. Why don't we add Laura's clarification on the end of the first sentence?
We want to redo these and recirculate them?
I think we probably should.
Let's do that.
I'll have to replay the tape to remember what I said.
Okay. All right, why don't we recirculate these, add those changes in and recirculate, and then we can review them again. I'm glad we looked at them at the beginning of the meeting. I'd like to go back to the agenda, that I trust everybody received the agenda. And I think one of our assignments from the end of, or the last part of last week's meeting, was to take a look at the data that Emily had distributed on last week on other communities' experiences and bylaws and commentary from a study that was done on this. And I think it's interesting, looking through all of this data, there are a series of experiences and responses that I distilled some responses to, and I just wanted to, I passed out a list of some of the things that I saw, but I'd just like to just ask, go around and just get people's senses as to, we were looking at one or two, or the approach was to look at one or two towns as being, let's say, representative of Hingham, in terms of Hingham's character and what you might have seen as threads that emerged from looking at this data. I mean, for example, what I saw was a very strong, in all of the towns, I saw a very strong trend for familial relationships. In other words, that the house would be, you'd have relatives, and it was also, one of the needs was essentially a generational need, where you'd have people who are, for example, senior citizens, and there would be a family member living in the accessory unit, which it's the issue of folks being related. And I'm wondering, did other people see that as one of the primary threads?
Yes.
I did. And I think that helps us kind of winnow things down. The other thing that I saw was a very strong emphasis on maintaining the single-family aspect of the house, but also within the single-family context of the neighborhoods. I mean, Hingham's majority zoning basically is single-family based, and if a unit is put into a house in a neighborhood like this, it seems to be very important to maintain that. What I was also intrigued by is how the approach was relative to that. In other words, there weren't any external projections allowed in some communities. There was an issue that anything that happened as a fundamental aspect of any change like this would be all internal within the massing or within the structure or within the envelope of the house. So you had the primary front entrance, and you didn't have appendages that would indicate, or other entrances that would indicate this. So the ramifications of that would be maintained. The other thing that I thought that was very interesting is the issue of eligibility and how the eligibility would be accounted for and controlled. The issue of the approval would be by special permit. I think I saw that unanimously in all communities. And also it was tied to the occupancy permit, and it was tied to a sunset provision where it was renewable within a certain frequency. And it was essentially, what it said is it wasn't permanent. It said that it was essentially a temporary situation.
None of them are permanent.
None of them are permanent. Temporary situation. They differ. There is differing time frames, but the philosophy was the same and the methodology was the same, which I thought was key.
Situate is silent.
It is silent, yes.
It doesn't, but that's, Concord was silent on it, too.
I was surprised to see that, and I think...
Sorry?
Is permanent.
Duxbury's is permanent. Interesting. The other thing that I saw is that there was an automatic expiration at the sale of the property or of the death of the primary owner in most of the communities. I'm not sure that was unanimous, but in most of the communities, and which would then reset the application process. So I think what I was interested also in looking at the data that we had is consequences both intended and unintended. It seemed that a lot of the communities clearly had shared notes, and it also seemed that in the edits to their bylaws, they were picking up on issues that clearly had come up in the interim, and they put them in theirs, which is, to me, they identified some unintended consequences and responded. So I guess in terms of the process, it seems to me that the most important thing to establish and discuss is the need, and kind of get a consensus on what is the need in Hingham, what is Hingham's unique condition, and how do we respond to that particular condition, Hingham's specific condition, in a Hingham-centric way. You know, clearly looking at what other peer communities have done, but I think the focus is really, in terms of the need, what is the group sense as to the if we were to write a statement of need, what would you think? What would you say?
Karen, may I just ask a
Sure.
question? After watching the hour and 38 minutes on TV, and I was not here last week, I understood most of it, but I had one question in
Sure.
the end. Before 1941, and there was zoning, anyone had a right to create a two-family. Since then, it's been by essentially...
Only by a special permit.
Special permit,
Right.
that would be the term for it. But then Emily showed a picture on the slideshow of a brand-new house. It was very attractive with a three-car garage and an in-law apartment above it. So this was not an existing house. This was someone who had come to town and bought enough acreage to have a number of bedrooms, and so that one can actually come to Hingham and have enough land, because I heard what Bruce said about, the water, and if there's enough land and they can create a 5-bedroom house, 2 of the bedrooms.
Was this permitted as a special permit for anything other than a single family? Do you remember?
Yep, it received a special permit that actually.
Microphone, please.
Sorry. That specific property had a home on it built in 1940, so it had a house that predated the zoning bylaw, and they altered and converted that structure to a 2-family with a special permit from the zoning board.
Okay, because that was the word that I kind of had underlined from the notes, that converted. It seemed to be that it was okay to convert a house, that, so I was surprised to see a brand-new structure that was allowed from the get-go to have an accessory
Excuse me,
unit.
was it a 2-family or was it an accessory?
It was a single family that in no way looks like the same structure that was built in 1940, but it was, through certain exclusions, extended and then through special permit converted from a single family to a 2-family.
Is it a 2-family or an ADU?
And now
we're making a distinction, right?
Now it is permitted as a 2-family,
Permitted as a 2-family.
but they are using that second unit for extended family.
Extended. Now, in terms of
That's the only way that they could do it.
Yeah.
under the
There was no
bylaw.
AD.
under the bylaw now,
So that's right.
in terms of that facility, what role did the existing house being built before 1940 play into that decision? Did it have
I don't
a
recall
bearing?
sitting on that one, but I would imagine that, that's the first thing the board would look for, is the house in existence prior to the implementation of the zoning bylaw, and that's that 1941 date.
Right.
And if it's yes, okay, then let's look at what the circumstances of the case are.
Right.
So I can't
I would
speak for
agree.
the board that sat on that one, but
Right.
I would imagine that's what they would,
Right.
imagine that's what they had done, so.
To just ask a further question,
Yeah.
then that house, before 1941, it was already a 2-family?
It was a single
Single
family.
family.
It was a single family, so any
So
house...
the bylaw
in-
does allow you to convert an existing single family to a 2-family, as long as it was built before zoning.
It does, and
Right.
is that based on the case law because of Falmouth?
No, there's no
No.
case law on that, that's just a provision that's been in the bylaw since that section has been in the
Okay.
bylaw.
Okay.
But isn't it called into question? Those 2 handouts that
It was called into
Right.
question, but
uniformity clause?
this, since there's no case law
Right.
on it, it's just a recommendation.
Right.
I don't think that it's, my sense is that one shouldn't just sort of roll over isn't the right word, but I think we need to basically be very careful about a discussion about the uniformity provision before we have a discussion about accessory dwelling units, and before we walk through all the issues of more than one unit on a property, because to just uniformly say, well, just because, a staff person in the AG's office made a recommendation, my feeling is that it's, unless it's substantiated by case law, we just stay with our current bylaw, because it's in our interest.
It's not a formal opinion
Right.
of the Attorney General.
Right.
There's no case law, there's nothing in state law,
They
so.
rejected 2 communities' zoning bylaws that were proposing similar provisions. So they weren't able to amend their bylaws in a way that Hingham has had since 1941.
I think they did that under the Administrative Procedures Act as arbitrary and capricious. I think I remember reading that language.
But that's really not why we're here.
No,
It's not why we're here.
It's not.
No, what we decided to do is,
But it's not.
it needs more research, and we felt that in our discussion last week, we felt that we really should focus on this. There are a number of other areas of focus that we had discussed earlier on the planning board. For example, multi-unit discussion is really perhaps a discussion that happens in the discussion on an overlay district, but it's not really the subject at hand relative to the accessory unit. So let's stay focused on this, and then we can, there are other venues, but,
Perfect.
clearly it's on the radar screen, but we wanted to focus
Right.
on this.
Yes.
And my sense is, I'm hearing that a strong sense that the related aspect of the occupants is key, and the subordinate role of the unit within the single-family house is key, and maintaining the character of the residential nature of the house is key, because that supports the residential context of the neighborhood. And I'm thinking, in terms of need, I have not heard, if one were to look at, let's say, if you start out looking at something and you try to quantify numbers, numbers of demand. One is the character of the demand. The other is the programmatic need. Specific people have come to us with a certain request, which tells me it's a need. And now the question is, how much of a need in terms of quantity when one entertains looking at something like this, does one put a series of trial balloon restrictions on it? In other words, a lot of towns have said 10 units max or 25 max, or, in other words, it's been because we haven't tried any of this, so it's...
I think that would probably not fly when it got to the courts.
Would not fly?
Yeah, right.
You couldn't put a number?
If you get the court.
That basically would provide privilege to some who came first and not to those who came after.
I see it in a number of these where
They
they did
do.
have it, but it may have just been because they were no more than 1% of the total housing stock was one of them. No more than 10 a year were a couple of them. So there were limitations that have been previously accepted, maybe not anymore, but... I
But
don't
it
know
would
what that
certainly
means.
put the permitting authority in a very difficult position
Right.
if they had to deal with that issue.
Okay.
And my sense is that would be kind of a reach on our
reach?
part. It's
Okay.
almost like we're trying to predict how many of these
Sure.
we would need. I mean, we run into situations with the bylaw all the time, and particularly with the table of uses, there's always something that comes up that's not in the table. That makes perfect sense, and the only way that we can approve it is to do a use variance, which seems kind of silly. I mean, you can't think of everything.
Right, so it's true.
Yeah, you just can't, so.
Well, I'd like to go back to, you've asked now several times for an expression of the need, and I think Mary and Emily have documented not only last week, but also in previous meetings about the aging population in Hingham. It's significant. It's on a percentage basis. I can't, I've seen it, but I can't remember what the number is, but it is significant. A national trend toward multi-generational living that has not existed until fairly recently, but it seems to be a bona fide social movement, and our town doesn't allow us to do it legally. So those are 2 points. And
I agree with Mark.
But by the way, it's 25% is 65 or older now, and it's moving up to the high 30s by 2020.
Yeah.
So it's a big number.
There's actually a very large percentage already that are multi-generational in this country. It's
Yes.
increasing, large group.
It's interesting that as a model, I think back to, my grandparents' generation, and it was a model that was very popular then and before. And then I guess with the evolution of more of the suburban model, I guess it declined. That's what I understand in terms of reading the demographics and reading the data. And now it's come back because the lifestyle and the realities of the demographics are saying, that this is key that we need to address. So it seems that I would concur that I think we've established that need, and I think that in establishing that need, and I'm trying to kind of put the parameters around it, we've established the character of it. In other words, it's basically related, I'm assuming. Is it in terms of the main single house? In terms of the character of it, is it also an outbuilding? Is it the main house? In terms of the need, in terms of how it gets expressed, in terms of how it affects the lot, how it affects the character of the neighborhood. Is that something that comes under the category of need that we should discuss? In terms of need, meaning maintaining the residential character of the neighborhood seems to be very important.
I think I would agree with that.
Well, if we're going to make this a special permit, then that's something that we would look at anyway,
In the special
because
permit
that's one of the
process.
findings that we would have to make.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have my bylaw with me here this
Well, I did
evening.
hear-
but
I
there's
did
a-
read that
But there's a
expressed.
whole series of findings that either the planning board or the zoning board must make in order to grant a special permit, so.
I think
And residential
one-
character,
One of the more
is
delicate
certainly one of them.
needs is financial. And in a town like Hingham, I think, the definition of that is difficult to put into words. But I think it basically means people that of a certain age living in a large house, it might be too much for them to care for because of a financial impact. And then the other side of that financial is the young couple starting out who can't, buy into the town that they grew up in, but their parents have a large home, so it's logical to do it. So the need, a financial need is there, but I'm not sure that that's going to be a fancy word or a word that people are going to want to recognize that way. It may have to be, yeah.
I think I agree. I think if sometimes when one thinks of it as financial, one thinks of it as a way of yield, but this interpretation of financial isn't yield. This is an interpretation of kind of resolving a constraint, where if the family wants to live in a more kind of a nuclear arrangement, multi-generational, this allows that to happen, but it also allows them to deal with the other issues, the related issues of being able to afford where they grew up, things like that. So I might look at it that way.
Gary?
Sure.
Amesbury had a nice way of phrasing this. They said in their notes, encourage greater diversity of population with particular attention to young adults and senior citizens. So that, I think, implies.
Yeah.
And that part of it, encouraging young people, goes right back, and Mary will remember this, to the report that we had that Hingham has a need, and the need is to be able to attract young people who normally can't buy into this town. But we need that for future growth, according to Tim Reardon's report. So again, there's two needs that could be addressed by doing that kind of thing.
I'd like to bring up another one, and that's property owners' rights. I would like this town to, this town's property owners to have property rights that are flexible and responsible and enforceable. But currently, I consider the zoning bylaw to be constraining in that area. So I'm looking at this as an opportunity to rectify something that has been maybe addressed in the past, but not with any great zeal. And then that also public safety has been brought up, and and this is kind of a negative need because it's been acknowledged and by many people that there are situations in this town, probably by the dozens or the hundreds of illegal, uncertificated dwelling units that are on the books, but public safety, the fire department, the police department don't know it, the town doesn't know it, and that's an issue that you talked about, a grace period, and there are towns who've done that specifically to bring people back.
One of the things that comes to mind relative to that subject is the issue of an amnesty provision where, recognizing that there are a number of units in this town and other towns that have been dealt with in this manner, there are accessory units, there are also other full units in some of these properties, and I think that there's an accountability, and then there's a an issue of code compliance, and there's an issue of, as you say, life safety in terms of knowing who's in the dwelling if someone needs to respond to an emergency. But I'm also thinking in terms of an amnesty program. Is that a kind of a program where, does it get initiated when the house is sold? There's a Title V review on a new owner. What's the time frame? How does that kind of interface into setting up a construct for the affordable or for the accessory dwelling unit? I think in terms of the specifics of how that gets worked in, because I'm thinking that on one hand, an unintended consequence could be that there might be a reticence to participate in an amnesty program. On the other hand, there might be an interest in participating in it, because then things can basically be accounted for. So it's related. It's a reason we would do it relative to updating the bylaw. I'm trying to think of the specifics, though. Get me a little bit concerned as to how or we would address some of these in terms of how far back we peel the onion, and you know, it's. But it's. I agree.
Gary,
yeah.
Could you clarify what you mean by amnesty?
Well, an amnesty program that I would see in terms might be involved with. I think it would essentially allow an owner of a house or a dwelling that has another unit in it to basically comply by actually getting a permit for that, going through the permit process for that.
A legal second housing unit.
A legal, yes.
Okay.
Actually, I should clarify.
We're not providing amnesty to people who have basically violated the zoning bylaw.
Right. I should have clarified that it's legal non-conforming versus illegal non-conforming. I guess I should have made that distinction. So if it's legal non-conforming, one could basically go through a bylaw and special permit process for those. The question, and that's where I was kind of alluding to, the question to how do you deal with an illegal non-conforming.
Well, can I ask the question a different way? So let's say you have this amnesty program. What's in it for the homeowner, other than to do, right by abiding the law? Because as soon as he triggers that, then the odds are pretty strong that it's going to cost him more money, right? Because there may be something that's not in compliance or something, right? So A, his costs are going to go up, and B, there's no value to being able to do that in terms of transferring the house. So you're not generating additional value that you can resell. So
you might, Marco, if you've got a provision in the bylaw that says upon transferability, the new applicant can come before.
So that'd be option.
Yes.
But that's only value if that next owner really wants that.
Well, I would think, and I heard this from Andover, and I'm not certain, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's the same here. But a lot of times, realtors will come into the office and ask about a certain property, and oh, by the way, it's got this second apartment in there. And really, it does? So I think people may have trouble in selling the property if there's an illegal thing. So that's the value, is to bring it into compliance. So if you're trying to sell, then you can sell.
Or the flip side of that is the owner, once that's triggered, his assessment is going to go up and his taxes are going to go up.
True.
So there's another downside of it. You just have to hope that one outweighs the other, because the assessment going up, and actually it can create value in as far as the property, depending upon how it's done, but it looks like it's always ever thus. But it can create value in certain circumstances.
The other aspect that I would look at relative to this is the issue in terms of compliance is that if everything is going fine, there's never an issue. But if there's an emergency in a building that isn't legal or has a series of code issues, then there's an issue of life safety and there's an issue of responsibility. And it seems to me that everybody basically, that we all go by the same rules. It seems to me that it's in everybody's interest if in an amnesty program, we could be done in such a way it would encourage people. You know, you'd have to look at a whole series of parameters, but you just...
Why would we permit a unit like this if in fact it didn't meet code and wasn't required to maintain itself in compliance with code?
I guess the permit process would require that the non-compliant items be rectified, but then it raises the larger issue if the building was converted after 1941 and it doesn't have a legal basis. It's one thing is the legal basis, the other thing is the life safety basis. You know, if you went through a permit process that basically got the building up to code and it was legal non-conforming, that's one thing. If you went through another one and entertained another property that was illegal and non-conforming, then that's a different process. And I don't know the answer to that one. But there are a number of those out there.
When you just brought this up, one of the nice things about this conversation is that it stretches us a little bit, but what does an insurance adjuster say when you've had a house fire and it's in the non-compliant illegal apartment, and the insurance company starts stroking their chin and say, well, let me see here. That could be a reasonably powerful incentive for people to come into compliance. But that would be an education campaign, I would think, once the law was on, bylaws on the books.
My sense is people differentiate with regard to town, in the town rules and regs, and filling out an insurance form for just that purpose. You know, how many kitchens, how many bathrooms. I don't know that to be fact, but that would be my understanding. They differentiate with insurance because they know it affects their pocketbook.
Yeah.
With the town, they're less likely to be as forthcoming unless their feet are to the fire, you know.
That's true. The other issue, and not stretching it too much, but the other issue that's also come up is the issue of houses that are going for permits now, that are going for permits as single families, but the layout of the house is clearly more than that, or would accommodate, I should say, more than that. And I was intrigued by the series of controls that Bruce Capman talked about last week in terms of there are certain density controls relative to numbers of bedrooms, relative to Board of Health issues. But I'm wondering in terms of if these houses are coming in with the idea that, not stated, but the idea that basically they could be converted, does that become an element that we also have to look at relative to the unintended consequences? If we say, okay, we have a series of accessory unit regulations, how do we cover the other ones that aren't quite set up for that?
Or do you mean a house that may have plumbing in the wall, anticipating a potential kitchen, things like that?
Yeah.
Well, I would think, in a way, again, if we were talking same family, you know, that kind of situation, they're preparing for it in the event of, in the hope of.
So I guess under that scenario, would you, there's the issue of the sunset provision where it's the reversibility. For example, if a house has an accessory unit in it and the provisions for the special permit are no longer there, it's the owner occupancy or they're not related, or any one of the provisions that we set up, is there a reversibility factor that goes into play? A lot of towns have that, where it would have to go revert back to a single-family house.
Most of them require a removal of the kitchen
Right.
within a certain number of days.
Right. Right.
Or at least coming before the board again and getting the special permit reissued or whatever. Somebody revisits the whole situation.
Right.
Because they may be selling to a similar situation, a family that needs it.
So the issue is, there's an onus that the owner has, which is to come, and some of them, it said every year they had to file a form that stated who the tenant was. That could help us keep track of, what ADUs are out there. And then, what is the town trigger? We talked about its sale, which is imperfect. Sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't work. We've got the Board of Health, the Title V certification stuff, and that Bruce thought was pretty good. But I think if we leave it up to the owner... Pardon me?
But that wouldn't apply town-wide.
Exactly. So if we leave it up to the owner, we know some are going to slip through, but it's probably a good first step, and so we have to determine what is the best way for the town then to maintain an inventory and check in on them regularly.
Well, there is a visit from the fire department with every sale.
Okay.
The fire department, whether you have sewer or not, the fire department goes in and checks the smokes and the CTO, so it's one visit that could incorporate that.
Would the fire department want to be zoning enforcement officers?
All they would do
Yeah.
is walk through to see if there were, I have no, I don't know whether they would want to do that, but at least it's a visual visit.
Seems to me we should be able, when a special permit's issued, to enter it in a database, whether it's 1, 3, 5-year check-in that should, kind of on a rolling basis, we should just be able to go out and make a call, make an inspection.
Yep.
Or require some reaction back.
Right.
Right.
As opposed to just an
Yeah.
inspection, either a
Right.
notarized certificate, affidavit.
An inspection would bring up, for me, issues of manpower, and
Yeah.
we only have part-time inspectors here. So.
Yeah.
So in terms of focus, it seems that we have a need and we don't have a vehicle to address the need. And so in looking at how one might frame the discussion, or how one might look at a vehicle, it seems that what I learned from the data from the other towns is it's a very complicated exercise to basically identify all of the parameters that we'd want met, and make sure that you'd also make sure that the unintended parameters doesn't become a loophole, that something else is done. And I'm thinking relative to approaching that process-wise, just want to get a sense of what people thought about framing this. We identify exactly what it is we're trying to do, and then develop a framework that would support that.
I don't know whether this is just what you're thinking about, but I'm thinking in terms of, I think we have one more meeting scheduled, and that maybe what I would like to see between now and the next meeting is something we can react to, a proposed language with various parameters in it. I mean, all of the towns that we've looked at have essentially the same kinds of parameters. How many units on a lot? Some of them have lot size minimums. They've all got to be compliant with zoning regulations and sanitary systems and all that. But we really can see from just the information we've got what the obvious categories are that we could draft a proposal. And then once we have it in front of us, we could pick it apart and expand on it, or do something. But I would like to, in a week's time, I would like to have something, a hard copy of something that I can look at and say, I don't think 650 square feet as a minimum size. I'm just picking something out of the.
Is this something that Mary or Emily would draft?
That we would, if the group wanted us to, we'd be happy to draft some language for you to then revise and edit and customize.
I'm wondering if we
Be very helpful.
set a series of priorities. We talk about a series of priorities, and when I looked at, in terms of approach, when I looked at the thinking in Cohasset, I was thinking that what I saw there was a very clear definition of what was allowed, and a very clear definition as to how one would go through the eligibility parameters and the accountability parameters and the enforcement parameters. And it seemed to me to be very well thought out. In looking at what folks are thinking and doing in Lexington, my initial evaluation or response to that was I thought it was very thorough. However,
It's really thorough.
but when I reread it, the motivation in Lexington is that they need to have more units in a finite number of dwellings because they're fundamentally built out. So Lexington expanded things further than what other towns have done. However, on the accountability and the enforceability provisions, in the sunset provisions, I thought they had a pretty detailed set of responses, which tells me that they've had challenges, that they've had issues. That bylaw's been edited over time to deal with the loopholes or to deal with the problems. And so I'm just reading between the lines. But in terms of maintaining the identity of, or the ones that I thought, the thinking that is most similar to ours in terms of maintaining our focus, Hingham's focus and our identity, some of the ideas that came up in Norwell and Cohasset, I thought, I mean, ironic that they're direct abutters, but the abutting towns, but ironically, I thought that their priorities seemed to be very similar to what we would think. So I'm thinking, should we focus on a list of priorities that we'd like to see met, and then take it to the next step.
Another, in looking, I have to admit, I didn't really catch up on everything, all the data that was given out. But one of the things that resonated, and we could almost go in the need column, is that some of these units could be counted as far as our affordable housing.
I was wondering about that.
It was listed in some of the documents.
Actually, they do that in Canton. There is a section that allows that as a LIP, as a local initiative project. Boy, that seems like a lot to bite off in the next week or so. Certainly an option, yeah.
I was wondering, Tim, in
because
terms
that comes
of your
with all of those
experience on that.
requirements.
Would people want to have deed restrictions?
Right.
On some
Well,
other-
and I'm not talking again about a rental not to create a tenant landlord. That, we don't want to get into that, I'm assuming. But if you have an elderly parent living with you whose income is finite, and they literally fall under, the guidelines for that, then that apartment that folk was in, that could be counted as an affordable unit.
Their housing marketing policy, so I don't think it could be limited to family members.
Yeah, I don't think you can select the tenant that you want.
But could we do?
Under the affordable housing.
But in effect, it would do that. I mean, if you're talking the spirit
No.
versus the,
Right.
you won't get over
Right.
your 10% hurdle for 40B, but it will effectively do what you're saying.
It wouldn't count.
Which would
It wouldn't
be
count in the
valuable.
subsidized housing.
Big A
Right.
versus little a, as Emily likes to say.
Right.
I don't think that's going to happen.
You have to go through DHCD to qualify.
Right.
And DHCD is going to have the marketing requirements that Emily talked about, that the non-restrictions of family members, that you're going to have that income level requirements. And we're going through the process right now for Beal Cove, a unit we just purchased, and Whiting Street, which we just started. And you're not going to have the kind of control that you would need to have
Qualify?
to qualify. Yeah.
Money too, don't you? You have to borrow from one of the subsidized, or it has to be...
CPC money or something like that, yeah.
Correct.
So, So you'd accomplish, and we would accomplish a good objective, but we wouldn't get credit for it. But-
So, sure.
I have another question. So we've talked a lot about family units, right? And that's the intent. There was some language in here about domestic help, or whatever it was called, basically people who are needing care, right? How do you accommodate that? I mean, would a unit that has a live-in nurse, home aide, whatever, would that qualify? Where do you put that?
There was language in a number of these that we could
Do we want
copy.
to include that, exclude it?
I would want to include it.
I would want to include.
It seems to me that individuals providing a medical service to somebody would be also responsible for, preparing meals and that type of thing, and therefore, why would you need a separate kitchen?
Well, and again, there are many units in this town that have au pair
Right. Okay.
setups.
So is the context of the relationship supporting the single-family aspect of the dwelling, is that a criteria that would include everything from a caretaker to an au pair? Because they're supporting the fundamental lifestyle, which is the single-family lifestyle in that neighborhood. So would that be a criteria that would cover that?
It wouldn't trigger it. There wouldn't be a need for separate accommodations. Matter of fact, there would be a need that there wouldn't be separate accommodations.
I don't know. I mean, I think if I were an au pair, I work from, at some point I go off duty and I want to have my space where I can eat my bowl of cereal or whatever. And so, and if I were a nurse, same thing. At some time I'd want to go back to my place and eat my own food. So I don't want to get too loose with this, but I would be in favor of including, again, supporting the single-family use.
Do I understand that most of the communities that we're looking at have unrestricted, they're not,
Yep.
not restricting to family?
70% of them.
I think I would
No,
be in
I
favor
didn't-
of
I
some
didn't get that
family
sense.
restrictions, to be honest with
You want-
you. Well, yeah, by blood or marriage, I think the issue of care, home health aide or something, would be an interesting thing that we could look at as well. Yeah, I can see the point for that. But I would primarily be interested in, restricting it to family. Because I think that's what the intent is. That's what we've been hearing, is the need, so.
And Gary, I would agree that the primary intent would be
Yeah.
family, but when I look at the list here of the 13,
Right.
there are only 2 or 3 of them that are solely restricted to family, and using as a model, we used to live on Gardner Street up the road from you for 13 years, and Sylvia Whittemore, her husband Judge Whittemore had been town moderator for many years. They took, when her husband died, they took part of the house and had another elderly widow live there, so that if Sylvia traveled, there was someone in the house. They weren't related in any way, but it was something that helped 2 elderly ladies in their declining years be supportive to each other. And I like that. And then when we left Gardner Street, we lived for 20 years in South Street, we bought a 2-family house, okay? But it really, the apartment was very small, but because we knew we had 2 widowed mothers. And for a while we rented it, but then for 10 years, we had a widowed mother who lived there until she died. And then we rented it again. And actually, the house was built in 1941, and it was legal, but I appreciated that flexibility. So I'd like to think there could be some flexibility. It doesn't have to be a family member.
One of the things that I've heard on this has been how tightly and how loosely we define things. And, I like the idea of, I'm thinking of enforceability now in terms of precedence. I clearly recognize that as a need, and I'm trying to figure out how do we set something up so that the exceptions don't ultimately become the rule, or just thinking in terms of enforceability.
If it's not a family member, if it's someone who's unrelated, why is that not an apartment rather than an accessory dwelling unit? Are we suddenly going to have like apartments all over town, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but I don't
It's
think it's what we intend here, so.
So one way, I think it was Amesbury again who addressed that,
Right.
is they required the accessory dwelling unit to have a single utility bill for electric, gas, and water. So that way it made it more difficult to rent unless you included that in your rent.
Must be a single bill for both,
Single,
for both
yeah, the
primary
owner.
and accessory.
Yep, single family.
Separate
Right,
utilities.
right.
I have an ignorant question to ask. What is the difference between tenants and boarders or lodgers?
I saw that case in Lodge.
Can anybody?
It seems like it's
It's
the
time.
duration.
It's time, yeah.
It's time,
Yeah.
the duration. Borders and lodges are very
It's also
short.
Temporary,
It's
short-term.
also sharing.
Sharing.
Tenants have their own kitchens,
Right.
their own baths.
Right.
Lodgers will share a kitchen.
That's a legal definition, is it?
I wasn't quite sure.
There's a lodging house definition, yeah.
Lodging house definition.
If there isn't, then it's in Webster, so it's good enough, right?
I also have another question, to open up the can of worms, right?
Right.
So if the intent is to allow elderly or whoever people to stay in their house, what happens if they don't have a care issue physically or whatever, but what if it's an income issue? Whereas they don't want their children moving in with them, but rather they'd like to rent that space because that would help pay for their property taxes or something. Then that becomes an apartment, I suppose. But how do you, that's one of these unintended consequences
Right.
that
Right.
somewhat adheres to the intent, but not entirely.
I think if
And that, I'll tell you right now, that's out there a lot.
it is.
Those are some of the things that I'll see in housing court. And it's you know, the building inspectors are no different anywhere in every community. You know, we don't see it, we don't, you know, we're not going to get in the way of it. And there are a ton of folks in this day and age, seniors, that everybody's moved out, they're now maybe, their spouse is deceased, they got a little extra room in the basement, and they're putting people in there. And it's a problem, and I think that we talk about unintended consequences here, and that's why I raised, you know, obviously I'm filling in for another member, but I'm looking at the occupancy limitations, and I see the unrestricted in most of these, and Gary, you started talking about enforceability. You know, well, we got an au pair. Well, they're not related. Well, we have a personal care attendant. Well, you know, I really don't need a personal care attendant, but we're going to call him a personal care attendant. And you're going to get to a point where, you know, we're going to have unintended consequences. I mean, we already have. We all know that out there are these units. They're just not registered. They're not legal. So we're not going to be creating. That's not going to be an unintended consequence of our actions. And they're already there. We're not going to create more. If anything, the consequences will be that some, you know, maybe there's cost concerns, but some will become legal, and maybe we'll chip away, and that's a good thing, because for safety purposes, most important. But you know, you folks are going to get into a point where you're going to be, you know, is this an unintended consequence? And there's got to be a reason why most of these communities are making it unrestricted. And I don't, you know, whether that's the reason or not. And I know that, you know, Mark first approached us a long time ago. It was, you know, we do have family situations, and I think those are very legitimate and a darn good trigger for getting us here. But I'm not sure you want to stop there. I think you really have got to look at the big picture. And safety is the most important thing. And I think that if you make it unrestricted, you're probably going to improve the safety of our homes. And you put your restrictions in. You know, Gary, you said you want to put your. Let's take a. You know, what are we looking at? What are the important factors that we want to make sure we limit? You know, is it a 1,200 minimum house size? You know, is it a separate entry or not a separate entry? These are the kinds of things that you clearly want to use to focus on what we want to see in our community. And
Because those are tangible, and they can be accounted for, and they can be regulated.
Yep.
But the intangibles, which would be the source of the unintended consequences, can't be regulated. So
you can regulate them, but you're really going to have a problem. I mean, there's no question.
Sure.
I think that you made a very good point. One of the things that I'd just like to suggest is, remember, most of this data, well, in fact, all but two of this data, these data, came from a report that's 10 years old. And so all of these towns which have this bylaw or on the books have been living with their regulations for at least 10 years, in some cases 20 and 30 or more. There's some pretty fine towns here with a whole lot of experience. I talked with 2 town planners today, one of whom was a town planner in Winchester for many years and is now in Weston, and she reported no problems. And the other one is in Westwood, and they've had it for years. And what she reported was seeing in the last year an escalating demand for these things, when she said it works fine. And so maybe one of the things that we could do also between now and another meeting is talking with more of the town planners on this list and saying, I mean, these have the neighborhoods changed in Cohasset, and have they changed in Milton and Norway? I don't know, but I suspect we all think that they're pretty fine towns.
I'd be more interested in talking to abutters to find out what their experience is.
You know, one of the planners today said that abutters, in her experience, abutters were not afraid to pick up the phone and drop a dime on something that was going on that they didn't like.
Well, the abutters will be dispersed, because these are broad bylaws, so it isn't, you know, you might have a house popping up here and popping up there. The question is, does everybody here want to have a neighbor or two or potentially 2 or 3, or I don't know how many, that may all of a sudden have a tenant that we don't know, and your kids are walking to the bus stop by it. And this can happen potentially anywhere in town, and are we comfortable with that? You know, there's been a lid on it in Hingham. Maybe it's because we've sort of been unaccommodating in our bylaw. Do we want to lift the lid? That's the question.
And I think that one of the things that I learned early on in the planning board is that, you know, there was the purpose of the zoning bylaw is really to protect the abutters from intervention. It's inconsistent with what the zoning and what the neighborhood is. And so, you know, I'm thinking that in listening to the idea of relatedness, in creating a potential bylaw for new units, it doesn't consider anything that's already been permitted. So in a new unit scenario, which would address from not moving from today on, or whenever we propose something on, you can basically deal more literally with the idea of relatedness. However, it's the buildings that aren't going to be proposed, permits aren't going to propose that, and or how do you deal with the existing inventory that doesn't currently comply? And is the exception, I get concerned when I think that the exceptions to the rule will become the rule. And the precedents that are set. And I think the trickiest aspect of this is the sunset provision. You know, in other words, if you set up a construct and then the family situation changes and it's no, the building is there and there's no longer a related aspect to the special permit down the road, then the whole issue of the practicality of reversibility and or, you know, in terms of the best compliance strategy is an incentive strategy. If we try to do a regulatory strategy, and chances are most of it's going to go undetected. And I'm thinking that, does one look at the parameters of how the tangible aspects are structured? For example, can be no more than 30% or 25% of the size of the building. Can be no more than 2 people. I'm just throwing these out. No more than, in other words, a series of performance parameters, no more than 2 people living there. Now, how does one address, and also the key one is owner occupancy. So
that's universal.
So there's accountability. So For example, we have houses in the town that are single-family houses that are not owner-occupied. And so you don't know who your neighbor is when someone's moving in. Chances are, when someone buys the house, you get to know the neighbors a little bit more because they're there longer. And I'm just throwing this out and responding to your concern, Laura, because that is concerning, not to know who's next door. Is there a way to set up a series of performance criteria that would tend to self-regulate so that you wouldn't get the downside risk? It's everything from, how two groups of people use the facility and the property so that it's in harmony. Is that another way to look at it, where you're saying so many parking spaces, everything's off-street, that kind of thing, all the way up to size of unit, visual aspects of cannot be visibly different than a single-family house. Things like you wouldn't know that it's different by looking at it. That's one aspect. And those are the tangibles. Now, if you articulate a list of constraints on the tangibles, and those are bylaw provisions, that's measurable. So when someone comes in for a special permit, it's tangible, it's right here, you meet it, okay, you do, no, you don't, no special permit. In other words, it takes the interpretive aspect out of it when the zoning board is reviewing it. And I'm just thinking God is usually in the details, Mies van der Rohe said that, but, is that the approach?
I thought that was the devil.
Have we determined, you think, around the table that we definitely want to, that what is existing is not adequate to meet the needs that we talked about tonight? Have we determined that? So there's going to be some change. Do you have something in mind, maybe just looking forward, rather than looking back at amnesty now, do you have something in mind going forward, or do you think we need to think a little bit more on that? Or because I'm thinking about next time if we have something to look at. Do you have some?
I'm thinking that there's how we approach this. I'm not totally sure we have a sense of that. One is there's the question of the ideal. We want to have, ideally, it be a related situation, but then we're also wondering what's the enforceability of that. And so, on the other hand, there are other mitigating circumstances that suggest that we look at other situations that support the single, I'm hearing this, that support the single-family aspect of the house, anything from the au pair to the caretaker. And then there's the third aspect, which is a person, a homeowner who's living in a house that they've lived in all their lives and they'd like to stay there, but they can't make it financially. And is there an aspect of support of that house or that's living situation? And that stretches it from where we were.
And that's outside the family.
That's outside the family. That stretches it from where we were earlier on.
It does stretch it, but I guess even then, you got to look at the big picture, saying, okay, how many homes do we have here in Hingham? How many people are actually going to take advantage of the change in the bylaw? I mean, I'm sure if you've got these communities that have been doing for 10 or 20 years, you're not looking up and down residential neighborhoods and everybody's got, an in-law apartment.
Right.
You really have got to, there's got to be a mindset, first off, that you want it, or that you have a family member that needs it, or you have children that require an au pair. There are those limited circumstances. We're not talking about putting two-family homes, up and down every single street in Hingham. So I think that looking at it from the things that you can actually put your arms around is a great way to approach this thing. I mean, that's the way I think you want to approach it.
Is there any data that says how many units are in Cohasset or Norwell? Do we know that?
That's a good question.
We called a few today, so we know that Lexington, for instance, has seen about 60 since 1983. So they, on average, get about 3 permits per year.
And what is their population?
Lexington, they have 32,000. Their 2011 income per capita was just under 90,000. They're comparable.
They're larger than we are by a third, but the income is the same. So the density's much higher in Lexington.
Yeah.
What about, do we
Hanover
have
says they see fewer than 5
Fewer than 5.
Hanover?
per year.
What about, well, Cohasset's much smaller in population, a third of our population.
But how many units do they have?
We did not contact Cohasset, so we got in touch with Andover.
I don't know the total number, but they have only seen maybe 5 or 6
5 or 6
applications
a year. They're a little bit bigger as well, 34,000. Income per capita, 66.6. We reached out to Duxbury. They see approximately 5 to 6 per year. In terms of comparables, Duxbury is smaller, they're 15,000, income per capita of 70,000, 2011. Contacted Norwell, they don't know how many they see a year, so that leads me to believe not many. But, no problems with it. And Situate sees approximately 6 per year. They are presently considering some amendments to their regulations to clarify the maximum size. They had done a square footage or percentage, whichever is greater. They're thinking of increasing the square footage but decreasing the percentage and saying whichever is smaller, so that they can make these really accessory units, not second units. The Lexington planner Mary had reached out to a while ago, so we mentioned they see about 3 per year. They've also modified their bylaws since 2004, since the Pioneer Institute. Language went in, I've updated it, and we can update your document, which was very helpful. But they updated it in ways to encourage people to use it. They were finding that it wasn't being utilized. So they removed some of their standards in an effort to get more people to apply, and they still, on average, only see 3 a year.
Emily, how many legal units do we have in Hingham?
You know, I just looked at the list today in the building department. I want to say for 2 families, so we don't have in-laws technically, but for 2 family units, it was maybe 60, 90, somewhere in there. I can get you that number. For 3 families, it was a much shorter list, maybe 12 or so. I'll tally them up, I'm guessing.
And for permits each year, how many would we see?
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
For permits for 2 families?
Well, yeah.
The zoning board reviewed 4 last year.
And that was a big year.
Yeah.
It sounds kind of like Lexington then, where
Do we know, as a percentage of dwelling units, do we know how many dwelling units there are in the town? Is it 8,000? 7,000?
I can double check for you.
I'm just curious. It seems like it's a very small percentage. I would think in terms of precedence, if people who you might know, just I'm trying to think of a typical situation. If we're looking at, say, size seems to be a critical parameter to control things, which would control numbers of people. Just controlling the size controls a whole bunch of related items. If we were to say, from what I was reading in some of the data, it seemed like 800 to 1,000 was a size that was typical, but I saw towns that were more like us were making it smaller. It was more like 500 to 800. And if it's 500 to 800 and the house is 3,000 or 4,000 square feet, then that's basically 25 to 30% of the house. And I don't know what the other towns have percentage-wise and where they stand in terms of that parameter, but I'm wondering if you know, for example, Mark, in your situation, your house is of a certain size, and I'm just thinking if one were to think out how livable and how practical it would be if you were to say that if you had a 500 square foot unit, an accessory unit, that's really a studio or a 1-bedroom apartment size. If you had an 800 square foot accessory unit, that's really a 2-bedroom, small 2-bedroom. If it were 1,000, it's sort of a medium 2-bedroom. So if you were to say, if the goal was to have it really subordinate to the house, and if, let's say, it was then extended past the relatedness, if you had a 500 square foot limit, that's really a single person, living in the unit. And I'm wondering, does the size of the unit actually become more important than whether it's people are related? I don't know.
I think one person is awful small.
I'm just, I'm just postulating on the size, but yeah.
I really agree with you on that, Gary, that one way to kind of tangibly limit it is the size, because I was in trouble somewhat reading this on the number that allow 2 bedrooms.
Right.
Like Lexington will allow 2 bedrooms, and you talk, Laura, about wondering who's living next door. An au pair or an elderly widow or, a caregiver or someone. I don't really understand why those people need 2 bedrooms. 2 bedrooms to me generally might mean 4 people living there. And I don't think we would sell this well to the town or whatever if we're creating situations where a family of 4 might move in. They might need the school system, they might need other services in town. I'm thinking we're really looking after something with a size that would accommodate 1 or 2 people, maybe elderly parents, but in a 1-bedroom situation.
I agree. To me, a 2-bedroom situation connotates a 2-family, whereas a single-bedroom studio or 1-bedroom apartment to me doesn't connotate that. I mean, just in terms of the...
2 bedrooms. I don't see how they're doing it in the square footage they're allowing. This doesn't mention the number of bedrooms.
Right.
The square footage has to be such that it's really only practical to have a 1-bedroom, so that it wouldn't have to be more than your elderly parents.
Right. In terms of going back to the need, do we have a sense of how many people would fall into the familial, multi-generational pattern of need versus how many people who would fall into the financial support category? Do we have a sense of that?
I don't.
I don't think there's any debate.
I don't know where you could find that out.
And I think just inferentially, when we talk about the aging population, that the weight might be on that end. But,
Yeah, I would say.
But
towards that.
Well, currently, an extended family can move into the town. In other words, a family can move in with grandma and grandpa, as long as there's only 1 kitchen.
Right.
Right.
And
I see, so it's still a single.
so, you can have 5 bedrooms in that house, or 6, or
And 2
whatever.
families.
And, in 2 families, but you can only have 1 kitchen. That's what we're talking about here, 2 kitchens.
Exactly.
That's right. Yep.
Gary, and I don't know if I missed it or not, are we keeping it all in the main house, or are we allowing the barn to be converted? Have we got that far yet?
I don't think we got to that
Okay.
portion yet.
Okay.
It's a good question. So if it's, in terms of the 2 kitchens, it's really 2 kitchens and 2 bathrooms, right? I mean, it's,
Absolutely nothing.
you can share, it's the kitchen that drives it.
If you got 2 stoves and 2 refrigerators.
That drives it.
2 units.
Okay, all right.
Yep.
What if, in order to kind of focus a little bit, we looked at it, at proposing it to the town, beginning with familial, seeing how that, what the need really was demonstrated,
Right.
By the applicants, and then if the need was demonstrated to be unrestricted, then we went back to the town and said, this is working, but there's a further need. I just throw that out to the group to see if it was a 2-step process.
I would propose to do it the other way around. I love simplicity. So I would suggest that you start out with unrestricted, see what happens, and then you could change the zoning law later, because you're going to run into funny situations that, are not intended, like, for example, wealth transfer. What if somebody said, oh, I want my parents to live with me, and that parent is well off, and he starts paying rent, and he pays, slightly above fair market value rent. So he's paying $3,000 a month rent for this 800 square foot apartment. Or maybe that is market value, I don't know. And that's a way to sort of transfer things. I don't know. There's going to be all these unintended things.
In a familial situation, I would anticipate it not being a tenant relationship. I mean, whatever one pays, it doesn't necessarily have to come under the heading
That's
of
right.
rent. Because any attorney will caution you not to create, even with family, a tenant, a landlord relationship.
Right. There's a whole series of other statutes
Ramifications,
plug
right.
into the relationship
Right.
that are, some are desired and some are onerous, and you're right, you lose.
The only reason I mention it starting the other way is because of, well, this is not a proper word, but in presenting it to the town. If we present it to the town as a family, which that is the need that we seem to be hearing, and then as opposed to we're creating units for anonymous people and unrelated people, that's a harder pill to swallow.
Yeah, I think so.
So you're still going to be running into the same problem we talked about before. We're going to include au pairs in that. We're going to include personal care attendants in that. You know, where are you going to draw the line?
Well, we're not there yet. It would be the response, I would think. We're doing this one step at a time. Maybe, I don't know if it's even if it's illegal or not, but I just throw it out as the first step.
I think where it's going to be potentially controversial is when it comes down to the discussion of units. Because in terms of, there's a fine line between 1.5 units and 2. You know, I'm just thinking in terms of, there's a fine line. 2 units connotate two-family and multifamily, whereas the accessory is really the subordinate unit within the house. And if it's related, I think there's a shared understanding of that need. But I think if it gets into the financial aspects as a need.
I think we're silent on that. That's a family decision.
No, I meant if it's non-related, and it's related won't be controversial. I think non-related might be, because it might get into, I'm not sure, but I think.
Again, you know, we got a whole lot of threads going here.
Right.
And we've been at this for an hour and a half.
Right.
I'd like to, I've said this last week, I'll say it again, I've said it tonight, I'll say it again tonight. There are a whole lot of towns with a whole lot of experience, and we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We have the ability to take from the experiences of other towns that, with leadership we respect and demographics that we relate to, and come up with something that's sensible. Again, something tangible that we can react to, and move forward. I sense a little spinning of wheels.
Well, I think that although I understand your point on other towns and what other towns have done, what I'm trying to figure out is, what does Hingham want to do? What do we want to do? And in order to, instead of just assembling components from the other bylaws, that assumes that we've got a consensus on what we want to do. And I'm not sure I'm seeing a consensus that goes any further than the familial. Is there a consensus to go further than that?
Well, yeah, it starts there.
It starts there.
I hear the arguments about unrestricted as well. I mean,
You're going to have, everybody's going to be their cousin or their second sister removed.
Right.
You're just, it's an invitation, I'm telling you.
Yeah.
You've got to,
no,
it's a legal nightmare.
I hear that, yeah.
You know, if that's all we're comfortable, I mean, you know, you do want to build a consensus on this committee. We do want to be on the same page to present it to the town. You know, I mean, we can have a majority report, minority report, but, you know, let's try and do what's best, what we think is best for the town, but also what we know is going to be enforceable.
Just looking at the spreadsheet and the columns, and looking for consensus here, things that I think are generally agreed upon, which is definition of consensus. Special permitting, a duration, compliant with zoning restrictions, size limitations, we leave that out. Minimum house size, we leave that out. Minimum lot size, we leave that out. Detached, that's up to, for further discussion. Occupancy limitations, I think up for discussion. Max number, 1 per lot. Owner occupied, yes. I mean, there are 5 or 6 categories here that I would submit we're all in agreement on. But.
Yeah, I think I would agree. I think I think there are a number of other aspects that, if we want to flesh something out, I think I would add in here, there are the controls. There's the eligibility. We've established the need. There's the eligibility. There are the controls, which is everything from dimensional to sewered, non-sewered, what we're doing in those districts, accountability and enforcement. And I think I don't think we should get into the amnesty provision. And I don't think we should get into the existing non-conforming. I mean, I think those are issues that are out there, but, I think there's only so much that one can digest as a start. So if that would be the case, then I think what we could do is we could put together a preliminary outline proposal, and looking at covering these bases that we could look at.
Okay, Gary, may I make a motion to ask maybe Emily and Mary to draft that so that we have a working document that we can check off during the next meeting? And agree, disagree on each of these items?
I think we could, but I'm wondering, should we essentially draft it while we're meeting? Should we?
I think we need to get into more discussion of the consequences. The need is there. Creating a bylaw that would provide for it is something that should be done. But I don't want to rush into it and then find ourselves going back to town meeting several times to get it right. I think that this committee or some other committee needs to take the responsibility of putting something together that's comprehensive, that addresses all of the problems that could potentially occur, that address the needs of the abutters, addresses the direction that the Board of Appeals should be taking when it reviews an application for this type of thing. And I think when all of that is together, then everybody will be supporting it. But there's too many unknowns right now, too many things that haven't been addressed, and turning it over to the staff at this point in time without that direction, I think is just going to waste their time and possibly not gain us any advantage.
Yeah, Dick, I think you're right. I think it would be helpful to have something to start with, though, so that we know. Right now, we don't know what the unintended consequences are because we don't know what we're starting with. I think it's good to start with familial, and then we can discuss the unintended consequences and how to deal with them.
For discussion purposes and
Right.
not supposed to be the final document, that's fine. That's part of the process, yeah.
Right. Well, then, perhaps the way to go would be to come up with an outline of the priorities, and then have that flesh out the areas that are unresolved, that are less resolved.
Gary?
Yeah.
Last week at the end of the meeting, Mary walked me through the process. Again, I'm just looking at the calendar. We're due to meet one more time before the presentation to the planning board, and then maybe you can, would you care to do that? There is time, and I'm Dick, I'm being respectful of what you're saying too, and hearing from other people outside of this group who will they'll bring up some of the unintended consequences too. But my thought is that if we design the skeleton, we can put flesh and bones on it as we move forward. But I think we need to.
See, my understanding of what...
So long as the flesh is there when it
Right.
goes to town meeting.
Well, oh, of course, yes.
Okay.
I don't think it would go by Mr. Condorf Dick's committee if it doesn't have.
Well, I
flesh
think
and
that,
bones.
you know, our task was to make recommendations to the planning board. I don't think that in 3 meetings, it's realistic to think that we can come up with a final draft or a significant draft. I think what we should do is basically start the outline of a draft, which would then be further resolved and discussed at next week's meeting, because I think that it's, to me, the schedule's artificial. It's got to get, we got to do this right, because a lot is riding on this. And so I'm thinking that we've had some really good discussions and brought out a lot of points, and I think we've stretched the envelope. Tonight's discussion on who it covers, I think, is key, because there's so many unintended consequences just in that, you know, why don't we have an outline? Let's look at an outline that we can then hash out next week, you know, in terms of the priorities. Let's set that, because I think we've got to come to some more agreement on some things, because I think there's some areas that, you know, I think the issue of the unrelated aspect that's where the biggest series of issues are going to come, you know, and how you articulate.
Is that something that we could accomplish between now and the next meeting?
Certainly.
Or maybe a
If I
couple
could
days
just,
before that?
Respond about the schedule. So this working group is scheduled to meet again November 5th, and then tentatively scheduled to report out to the planning board November 17th, which is a planning board meeting. And the planning board needs to vote November 24th as to which warrant articles they may send upstairs to the selectmen to have for town meeting. Now, sometimes those warrant articles that are sent upstairs are completely final, and sometimes, although it's not a preferred descriptor, they're placeholders. In other words, it may not be final language, but you send up something broad in scope to identify what you're proposing. You can always narrow it down. You can't broaden it once it gets sent upstairs and put onto the warrant. Once a proposed bylaw revision goes to the selectmen, they refer it back to the planning board, and we open public hearings. And then it's during that public hearing process that input from the rest of the town or anyone who cares to come is received. The language is typically really vetted, modified, edited during that public hearing process. So that's just to answer the question about the timeline and the schedule. If the group felt that you wanted to advance a bylaw, that's kind of the parameters that you would do it. Now, to Gary's direction, could we certainly put together a framework and decision points based upon what we're hearing from you that you have consensus on, and then maybe highlight some of the other critical points that we need your direction on in order to come up with a more fleshed out bylaw, if that's your direction? Of course we could. We'd be happy to. We could probably get it out within, say, a week. I think we could commit to that to the group. So you could reflect on it in advance of the meeting and then really have a robust dialogue when you come in, if that's what you would like.
Sounds good. Yeah, sounds good.
I like the idea of that.
And in advance of the meeting would be very important for me, since
Yeah, that
I
would
have
be
to
good.
apologize in advance. I will not be able to attend the next meeting, so
You can submit your comments
I
away.
would submit my comments prior to the meeting to staff.
Is there any way, in fact, maybe even the members can do this, I think it would be helpful if we call these communities and ask them why they are unrestricted. Did they have experience with family restricted, and then for some reason they went to that? If we could get maybe input on just that category.
If committee members would like to select, so we can take notes of who you might be calling,
Yeah.
so we don't have duplication. If you'd like to call and ask the same questions and then report back to Emily or myself, we could compile that.
Okay, well, I'll take the first two, since I spoke with Andover earlier today and tried Canton
And I'll take the last two because I've spoken with them.
There you go, Westwood and Wellesley.
I'd like to ask-
The point is to ask about the restricted versus unrestricted,
Yes.
is the
Right.
intent?
Yes.
Okay, and so Mark's got the last two. Who would like Cohasset and Concord?
Well, I'll do Cohasset and Situate.
Cohasset and Situate?
I'll do Concord and Dedham.
Concord and Dedham, now
Yep.
there's a bookends.
Yeah.
I was thinking I was interested in Weston.
Mark's got Weston.
Oh, Mark's got Weston, you got, and Wellesley, Mark, is that who you have?
No, Wellesley doesn't have it, and if you'll and see on that second page,
I saw that, yeah.
I teased out of their website the planning board minutes of November 19th, 2012, when a Mr. Himmelberger asked the board to consider investigating possible zoning language to allow for in-law apartments, and the board declined. So they weren't interested in pursuing it. They thanked him for his suggestions.
Has anybody picked Lexington or Milton yet?
No, you can have them,
I'll
Gary.
have those.
I can take Duxbury and Norwell.
Awesome. So
What's
so
left?
we just have Rockland.
I'll call Rob.
Now, who would you suggest, what department?
That's-
We're going to start with the town planner, and then if
There is
Unless
one.
there's zoning staff, it's usually the zoning board that issues the permits.
Okay.
So Eileen, did you have Duxbury?
I have Cohasset.
There was a Taylor Emery in Duxbury that was very helpful. She's there, she staffs the zoning board.
So what was the consensus? Start with zoning?
It depends on who issues the permit. I think the board who issues the permit would, although if you're asking about why they made a certain zoning amendment, maybe the planning board makes more sense. So if you want the nitty gritty about how the permits are issued, call the zoning, but if you want ideas about the planning, it's probably.
if you want to talk about restricted versus unrestricted and kind of broader.
But also any enforceability issues that they've
Run
encountered.
into.
Okay, so we have people have their homework. You didn't get any homework?
I'm just a fill-in.
Homework by proxy? Okay, so we will commit to, within a week, turning around our homework to you. And then as you report into us, and I would just suggest if you could just email Emily and I, instead of the whole group, then we will tabulate that and turn that around as quickly as we can.
Right.
Could we also get a sense of the inventory on how many units we currently have, and is there a way to get us some kind of account as to units that have been proposed to? I'm just trying to get a sense of what inventory versus what the demand is on that.
But not permitted, not approved?
Right.
Yeah, that might be a little bit trickier. We have a really great list of all units that are grandfathered units.
Okay.
We will try to tease out which ones have been permitted by special permit. It's a little bit tricky because our records aren't easily accessible in that type of detail, but we'll do the best we can.
Okay.
Yeah.
Have there been any applications that have been denied?
Joe, do you know of any? The last 4 that we looked at that were
Two
all
families?
approved.
Right, yeah.
But I don't, that's as long as mine
Even with
is.
the bed and breakfast, I think we've approved the ones, other than the ones that have withdrawn.
Right.
We did have one that was withdrawn at the Hersey House, yeah.
Yeah, but that was, yeah.
That was other circumstances. That was the whole,
Go there.
right, exactly, yeah.
That's a little off topic.
Right.
I'd submit when you talk with these town planners, it's fun. They're interesting people, and they've got good ideas, and it's
Yeah.
And a good perspective.
Right.
Great. Is there any other business that we need to do? Motion to adjourn?
Seconded.
Oh, approved. Great.
Aye.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
I'm going to go for 3 hours.
So I'll try to make time.